The Pacific Young Women's Leadership Alliance, or the PYWLA, or the Alliance for short, came about as a result of a meeting in Bali in 2009. And it was convened by the World YWCA. And in 2009, 33 young women were talking about how young women's issues, it was still not visible. Young women were not included. And even though there were meetings carried out whereby perhaps one young woman or two young women were there, their voices weren't represented in that meeting. And hence the idea of having something like the Alliance or a network whereby young women were supported to not just talk about young women's issues, but also a place where young women were visible to talk about their issues. So the main, I guess, the goal behind it was to ensure that young women were visible and their issues were taken into account. Hence the idea of this, the creation of the Alliance, if I must call it. They had this idea, like instead of creating another group, why not work with existing groups that was already working in young women's leadership, also groups who are working with young women. And this in many ways helps with resources, saving resources, because we all know that here in the Pacific and also out of the Pacific, whereby funding is scarce, it's reducing, and the spaces are also reducing. So they decided to build an existing work. They recognized that there were organizations, there were groups already working with young women, and also save time, money, and resources. And as a result of this, we have the Pacific Young Women's Leadership Alliance, and the Alliance is made up of organizations based here in Fiji. But the idea was not to work with organizations who were specifically working with young women in Fiji, but those who had a regional, I guess, work or regional reach. And the organizations who currently make up the Alliance are Family Pacific, because of their work with young women, and also through the GPAC Pacific Network. We have UNFPA, we have UNICEF, Fiji Women's Rights Movement, and trying to get in touch with Red Cross, and the Pacific Youth Council, and SPC. And currently, they make up the Alliance. And the whole reason why these organizations are there is because they also have, within their organizations, they work with different networks, different groups. And the reason why, once again, to work with these organizations is to work together on common goals for the development of young women's leadership, to create change that is needed to fully participate in decision making, and also to collaborate in empowering young women. You may ask, why young women, right? Why not young men or other groups? The reason why this alliance was formed wasn't to further marginalize other groups, but there was a realization that young women were still not participating. Young women's issues were still not visible. Young women were not empowered enough to come and talk about their issues. And this is the reason why we are working with young women, that there was a strong need to start including young women in these spaces so that they themselves can be talking on behalf of themselves and not just somebody else there who's in the decision-making space and talking on behalf of a young woman. If you don't have young women present in these spaces, you will not be able to hear their experiences. You're not able to come up with strategies to respond to their needs. And this is why the Alliance chose specifically to work with young women, was to create the visibility. Why should young women be involved in decision making, including in peace and security? My question is, why not? Why is there even a question on why young women should not be involved? Because the decisions that we make on a daily basis not only affects us as individuals, but also affects everyone within the community. And young women need to be involved because they're also a group that, because they're equally affected by the decisions made by our leaders. Also, the Pacific region has one of the highest population of young people. This is taken out of the YWCA statistics, and it comes to about 56%, out of which half of that are made up by young women. So why should young women be involved in these decision-making processes? Young women are impacted by issues differently. If you think about it, if you have decision makers, right? You have our leaders coming up with recommendations, solutions to our problems. And it's a space where in most instances, it's male-dominated. And then you have women's issues, and they're trying to talk about us as women, and this is what we are going through. You have marginalized groups. And then you have young women who are also faced by these issues differently. And we are all faced, yes, we may have similar needs, but we are all affected differently in cases of conflict and disasters. So they need to be in decision-making spaces so that they are able to provide strategies for their own issues. Also, I've mentioned that already, strategies and recommendations made by young women are from their own experiences and needs. And the other one is changing norms and traditions. Often we don't really think about it that way. I mean, for me, when I was reflecting on why we should involve young women, I really didn't think about this response of changing norms and traditions till I asked around and asked other young women. And they're like, oh, it's simply that, changing norms and traditions, because often we have spaces where we only have our male figures, or you have the more empowered women speaking up. And also, by involving young people, involving young women at an early age in these spaces, you're empowering them. You're also providing them with the necessary tools for them to be able to make better choices in life. Also, they become more, the space in itself is more inclusive, and these young people who will become better leaders. Also, they bring in new and different perspectives. We all have to realize that sometimes to that old conflict, sometimes we might need a new perspective or a new recommendation or solution, because that particular solution has not worked for the past 20 years or 10 years. Perhaps it's time that we need to include other people who are affected by a particular conflict or issue for them to come up with recommendations. And young people, especially young women, come up with that. It's the ideas are innovative, and they provide a different perspective, and also the realization that in our world today, the use of technology, so they can provide that. And issues and solutions have evolved over time. Ways forward. We need to collaborate more. When I say collaborate, we need to start working with young women, not just say it or just mention it in your outcome statement or documents, but we really need to be serious about this collaboration. We need to start including young women in these spaces, not just talk about it. Make time to meet with young women. Respect is key as well, goes both ways. And stay connected with young people, not just only when there's a big meeting coming up and that's your way of trying to mobilize young people just to get their opinions. And you simply cannot talk about peace, human security, justice, development, and inclusiveness without the inclusion and participation of young people or marginalized groups and young women. And basically that's it, and I hope in this little presentation that you can start connecting the dots, because I don't want to be telling you what to do, but I want you to be asking the questions and realize the importance of working together. And the alliance in many ways is an avenue where hundreds of young women are channeling their issues, their voices. And also it was through the alliance that for the first time we had a high contingent of young women present at the 2013 triennial. They mobilized, they were very strategic, because they also realized that spaces and time is usually a challenge. And they had to really think about what they wanted to tell their leaders. And yeah, and they mobilized themselves and made sure that the speaking time was shared amongst each other. And even within the Young Women's Forum, I'm not sure if you've heard about the Fiji Young Women's Forum, but basically it's a group of young women working with young women who have mobilized to ensure that young women's issues are heard. And they're very strategic in the sense that they know exactly who to target, who to work with. And they recently had their strategic planning retreat just 2 weeks ago. But anyways, that's the end of my presentation. If you want more information,
it's in your pack, the Pacific Young Women's Leadership Alliance Peace and Security recommendation.
Okay. It's in your pack for more information, but also if you can go online and there's a detailed like booklet from the online discussions that took place in 2013 with recommendations.